I think we should always try diplomatic solutions before we resort to military options. Of course, the trick is with diplomatic efforts, it usually takes time, takes a lot of patience. And sometimes it isn't in the headlines, so people aren't sure if anything is being done because discussions have to be behind closed doors when they're sensitive. But I think it's important not to put our young people in the armed services in harm's way unless absolutely necessary. And so from my point of view, diplomacy is always the first thing you try to work out. And then if that doesn't work, then you might consider military options. When you say security concerns, you mean relating to American personnel, diplomatic personnel? Well, I'd say a couple of things on that. Number one, there obviously are security concerns and we have to work with them. But number two, we also have jobs to do. And it is important that we find a balance, that the right balance be found between removing unnecessary risks, not taking unnecessary risks, but at the same time being able to get out, talk to the people you need to talk to. If you have an embassy in a country like Iraq, where there are important people that you need to talk to encourage them forward politically, it does no good to have a big embassy staff trapped behind the high walls of an embassy where they can't do their work. In that case, you don't really need an embassy. So you've got to find the right balance. Even Chris Stevens in Libya understood that there are risks to the job. I think we all understand that there are risks to the job, and while we don't want to be reckless, we do want to get our jobs done. I think it comes in cycles. If right now there's a lot of politics in Washington too, let's be honest about that. There are people in the Congress, I think, who are less interested in the safety of foreign service personnel. If they were more interested, they'd vote higher security budgets, give us more resources. So some of this is politics. We've lost how many American ambassadors in the last 40 years? I think at least 5, ranging from Afghanistan to Sudan to Lebanon. So Libya, of course, with Chris. So I think the concerns go up and go down depending on whether we lose someone high profile or not. It's tragic, it's sad, but it's just the way Washington works. Well, I think the main, I've been in several places where embassies have been physically assaulted, Bahrain, Iraq, Syria. I have been taken at gunpoint in Iraq by a Shia militia and held for a few hours, then released. And I've been under fire in Iraq where we've had rockets coming down. I had a rocket land right outside my front door in Baghdad one day. It's just the nature of the job, but it was the work we were doing in Iraq, for example, was important. We were trying to stand up an Iraqi government so that we could get our soldiers out, and I would say we succeeded in that. So the risks were there, but they were risks worth taking. In my 28-year career in the State Department, my wife and I served in separate countries apart from each other for a total of 12 years. And I tell young diplomats coming in that it's hard. It's a hard lifestyle on families. The housing is okay, but you should not expect to always be living with your family. When we have people going to Afghanistan, we have a huge embassy there. In Iraq, we have a huge embassy there. They can't take their families. I think now more than half of our posts in the Middle East, people cannot take their families. This is just the nature of the threat. And so what used to be, I think, maybe in the 1950s and 1960s, a more comfortable lifestyle, nowadays is more uncomfortable, and most middle-class American families are dual income earners, and that's very hard when you're living overseas and one spouse, the spouse who follows, has to develop a career jumping around foreign country to foreign country every 2 or 3 years. So it's not so easy. I was really interested in foreign languages and history when I was in high school. And so I read a lot of history even when I was in high school, international history. When I got to college, I heard about the Foreign Service, and I joined the Peace Corps actually initially just to see if I liked living overseas or not. And the Peace Corps was a fabulous experience. I loved it, and I loved living overseas. So I applied for the State Department. Well, I think the story of America's foreign policy for the last 240 years is a story of diplomacy dating back to Benjamin Franklin's successful efforts to get the French to provide us help in our struggle against the British and to help us gain independence, and with very valuable efforts on the side by people like John Adams in the Netherlands to secure loans to help George Washington and the American Continental Army. So, and that goes all the way through efforts by the State Department to keep foreigners out of our Civil War while we settled our problems among Americans on the battlefield, unfortunately, and then right through World War I and World War II. So really American history, especially with respect to what we do with foreign countries, is largely a story of diplomacy. More diplomacy is every day. Military actions, thankfully, are not every day. On many occasions when I was an ambassador or working for an ambassador overseas, we had American companies that were doing business or sought to do business in the countries where we were working. For example, an American company that manages electricity power plants was looking to do an investment in an African country, Central African country, that was opening finally its power sector to private investment, and they were competing against French and other European companies, and we lobbied hard with the local government to get that American company the contract to build the power station, and they're operating there now. When I was in Algeria, we had a different American company also involved in power and infrastructure projects, bidding on a contract to build a huge water plant, water desalination plant, that is now providing a third of the water to the city of Algiers, the capital of Algeria, and it's a privately owned operation which they manage in partnership with the Algerian authorities. Most of my work has been on a bilateral level between the United States and the country where I was stationed. However, a lot of our work on Syria, and especially our efforts to mobilize countries in the Middle East to back a political solution, has involved big conferences with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with Secretary of State John Kerry, and countries ranging from Turkey and Saudi Arabia to Jordan, and then a host of European countries, France, Britain, Germany, where we bring all of these countries together and try to agree on a common way forward. I think we've had some success on that, but not enough yet to generate sufficient pressure on Bashar al-Assad to negotiate seriously. Had a lot of good moments and a lot of bad moments. I think perhaps the best time I ever felt was when we got the Iraqi government in 2006 stood up after 2 rounds of elections and a constitutional referendum, and the new Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki took office as a permanent elected government. And then we could tell then that we would be able to get our forces out of Iraq because there was finally an Iraqi partner that would be able to take the lead. That was a great feeling. I can't tell you how hard it was to watch our young people out on those street corners in the Baghdad heat and dust in the middle of a war zone. Just wanted to get them home. It has to be in Syria, where we saw a government brutalizing a population, I visited people who had been tortured by the regime. There was nothing really we could do about it. I led a group of foreign ambassadors to the funeral of a young, peaceful political activist who was tortured to death by the Syrian authorities. And it was an incredibly brave family, but we knew that they were going to get arrested as soon as we left. They asked us to come. We did come. Very brave family, trying to make a statement, calling on the international community for help. And sure enough, within an hour of our departure, the Syrian secret police swooped in and arrested dozens of people. In 2011, I was brought home for about 6 weeks because there was threat information against me. We think probably generated by supporters of the regime, because I was very visible and very vocal supporting the rights of Syrians to protest peacefully, and the government was responding with incredible brutality. But I thought it was important to speak out about the right, universal human right, freedom of expression, and the right for peaceful assembly and protest. Then we had to close. I went back to Syria in December 2011, but we had to close 3 months later because the embassy was getting threats from a different quarter, and we couldn't get the Syrian government to take the measures necessary to protect the embassy. In so many ways. When I was a young diplomat, State Department reports were often the only source of information coming back to policymakers about countries we were working in, like Turkey and Egypt, at least the only rapid source of information. And when I was serving in Algeria during the civil war there, and I was the head of the embassy's political and economic affairs office, we were often the only source of information because there was no international media. But fast forward 30 years, if you want the quickest information, you should be checking your Twitter account. If you want to get a message out, in the old days, we would talk to newspapers, would try to get on local TV. Nowadays, if you have a Facebook account, you're going to get immediately a few thousand people to see it, and local media will then read your Facebook posting and put that on the news, so it'll be on there within an hour. I found that while the Syrian government hated it when I would talk to the Arabic media, if I put something on our Facebook account, they couldn't block it, the Arab media would pick it up instantly. So we've had to learn to work with them, and we also have to learn to be careful, because the leaking by an American military service member of thousands of State Department reporting cables has caused us some problems. People are more reluctant to talk to us because they're worried that what they say might get published. I know personally people in Syria who had to flee the country once those cables were published, and then it was known that they were talking to the American embassy. The people like Julius Assange, who think that there has to be total transparency, do not understand how to work with truly brutal regimes. There'll be several. One will be being able to recruit the very best people to represent our country overseas. As I mentioned, it's harder and harder on families. More and more people are having to serve 1 or 2 year tour assignments apart from their families. No one enjoys that, and a lot of people don't want to do that. Second, it's interesting with younger people now, a lot of them don't view the State Department as a long-term career. They view it as something interesting to do for 4 or 5 years, and then time to do something else. And yet I think there's a real value in having someone who has been doing this for 25, 30 years. You bring more experience both in terms of working with people and institutional knowledge, substantive knowledge about the regions you work in. And so recruitment and retention of the best people will be a hard challenge. The security environment is absolutely getting more challenging, more difficult, and learning how to work with that. And again, being able to find that balance between risk and getting the job done It's harder now than it was 25, 30 years ago, for sure. And then finally, the State Department itself, of which the Foreign Service is a major piece, not the only piece. We work with civil service colleagues, but the State Department itself has to remain relevant in terms of the interagency process and in terms of the American public and explaining to the American public what we are doing. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, when you're in a hard diplomatic effort, there aren't going to be a lot of tweets about it. There's not going to be a lot on it on Facebook. It doesn't lend itself to instant news all the time. I think the president should name whomever he wants as his personal representative to a country. So I certainly don't begrudge the president that right, and I don't begrudge political appointees taking up these posts. I've worked with political appointees, both directly. I worked for one in Iraq, and he was very skilled. He was very capable, and he brought a sense of dynamism to the team, and he was very good, very capable. And I've worked tangentially with others when I was in Algeria on counterterrorism issues with political appointee ambassadors in places like Spain and France, and they were extremely capable, Morocco as well. So I don't think it's as that big of a problem. I do think you obviously want to pay attention to whom you're naming as a political appointee, and I leave that to the White House. And then I would just hope that political appointees would see the value of the professional diplomatic teams working under them and learn to benefit to the maximum from the skills, the expertise, and the capabilities of that team. An embassy is a team. It is not just an ambassador. I think the unhappiness that burst into public view in 2011 with the Arab Spring, even 2010 in Tunisia, really was developing over a period of decades. Those of us who were working in the region saw more and more signs of just general dissatisfaction with the status quo throughout the Middle East, and we were reporting on that. It was not a secret to our team in Egypt that Egyptians were feeling ever more the pinch of inflation on the one hand and unemployment on the other, sort of nasty stagflation. The same in Tunisia. In Algeria we saw it, and even in some of the countries in the Persian Gulf. So that was not a surprise. I think what's interesting was that there were certain catalysts which seized on popular dissatisfaction in places like Tunisia and Egypt, combined with young people's better understanding of how to use new technologies to generate street protests. And so in, for example, Egypt, even in 2006 and 2010, we started to see young people using Facebook to generate attention to cases of police abuse. Police abuse is a long-standing problem in Egypt, but using Facebook was a relatively new thing. And it outflanked, in a sense, the Egyptian authorities' abilities to prevent protests. And the same thing happened in Tunisia, and the same thing ultimately happened in Syria. You just don't have enough censors to be able to block every single Facebook, every single Twitter account, and therefore, in a sense, the young people used modern technology to outflank old-fashioned regimes. Well, when it started out as a protest against the arrest of some, they were adolescents, they were 12, 13, 14-year-old kids in a city to the south of Damascus called Dara, who spray painted on the wall what they had seen on Arabic satellite TV, bring down the regime. And I think adolescents spray paint all kinds of things. I live in Baltimore, we have plenty of graffiti. But in Baltimore, they don't arrest kids and pull out their fingernails, which is what the Syrian secret police did. And parents were furious about that and generated some marches. And what happened in Syria, again with this new technologies, with their cell phones, people in Dara took pictures and movies of these large marches and put it on the Arabic satellite television, which the Syrian government couldn't block. And so, in an unprecedented way, people all over Syria saw what was happening in this city in the south and said, we have the same problems. And the protest movement within a week or two spread to many cities, peacefully criticizing government abuses and corruption. And unfortunately, the regime responded with horrific brutality, but for the first 6 months, the protest movement was thoroughly peaceful. Well, in a sense, it is a proxy war because as it has become nastier and in some senses turned into a sectarian civil war, pitting a Sunni Arab majority against a Shia Muslim minority, regional states have backed their sides. And so Iran is backing, no surprise, the Assad regime and its Shia Alawi support base. And countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who are very much view themselves as leader of the Sunni Muslim world, are backing the Syrian opposition. I hope in the end Syrians realize that foreigners are not going to solve their problems and that Syrians will have to reach across some pretty deep divides now, and many of those divides filled with blood. And as Syrians who all live in the land of Syria come together and find a political solution. That's what we, the Americans, have always wanted. Oh, it does on several levels. The most visible one, of course, is the rise of the Islamic State. In a space that had been ungoverned, the Syrian regime could not hold it against the Sunni opposition, but in turn the Sunni opposition splintered, and so there were vacuums and into vacuums, just as we saw in Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan. In Syria, this terrorist group, the Islamic State, set itself up, and I think if you read their warnings and their threats on the social media in Arabic, which I do read, they're pretty blood-curdling. They intend to bring jihad to Western Europe and to North America when they're finished in Syria, and I take them at their word. It's also a threat in the sense that it is a resource draw. It pulls resources in. The United States now has spent $2.5 billion on refugee assistance. About 3 million Syrians have been displaced out of Syria into neighboring countries. That sheer weight of desperate humanity is in turn posing risks to the social order and the stability in countries like Lebanon. There were anti-Syrian riots last night, September 7th, in Beirut. Jordan is having a hard time even getting water. Jordan is a water-short country, and guess what? The population of Jordan has just increased 1 million people. So they've got, where are they going to get the water for that? Turkey is suffering. And there is no sign yet that the conflict in Syria is going to diminish or that the United States will be able to avoid these expenses, literally money expenses in budget-conscious Washington to help people. Series of things. Some of it are programs which where we directly fund non-government organizations that are providing help to Syrian refugees. Could be International Mercy Corps, could be International Medical Services. Both of these are very reputable NGOs that work in crisis situations around the world. Some of it goes to the United Nations, which operates emergency food programs and emergency health programs inside Syria, working under the supervision of the Syrian regime. We know that, but the UN is doing its best to channel the assistance into the areas of greatest need. And some of it is support then to other Syrian organizations that are trying to get aid inside Syria to address people that are in desperate situations. I think the president has been very reluctant to get involved in military operations in Syria. It's obvious, and I think the president on one level is correct that this is not fundamentally a military problem. This is a problem about power sharing in Syria, and power sharing means politics. So I certainly understand the president's reluctance to get involved in an open-ended military situation in Syria. However, there are people who have directly sprung from the peaceful protest movement who still believe in a free Syria, in a non-sectarian Syria, who are not trying to impose some kind of medieval Islamic system on Syria, and who are willing to negotiate with the regime, and who went to Geneva and put proposals on the table that the Assad government refused even to discuss. Those people, I think, do need help. There is an armed opposition connected to them, and I think we do know who they are. I think we have worked with them now for at least a year and a half, and we may not have perfect information, but in diplomacy you never have perfect information. But we have enough information to know which among them are relatively good people and deserve our support. The task, or the challenge, I should say, the challenge of finding a solution to the Syrian crisis is certainly harder now in 2014 than it was in 2011. 2011, they weren't even asking for Bashar al-Assad to be removed initially. They just wanted the policeman who pulled out those fingernails of those kids in Daraa to be removed. Now it's a much more complicated problem. A lot of blood's been spilled. Foreign countries are involved. I'm not quite sure what the final solution in Syria is going to look like, but I do know that whatever it is, it's going to involve a negotiation. Whether that negotiation creates a new national government of some kind, or whether it decides that Syria should be some kind of heavily decentralized country or a federation, I don't know. Syrians have to answer that question. Americans can't. Foreigners can't. We should be trying to encourage a process to start, which is open-ended enough that Syrians would have the room to negotiate something which can be durable, which can be sustainable. You know, after 200,000 dead, after multiple uses of sarin gas, after now using chlorine gas after he stopped using sarin gas, torturing to death literally tens of thousands of people. We've seen the photos of some of them, not all of them, some of them. I personally cannot imagine how the man himself can stay. But you know what? I'm an American. I'm sitting outside of Syria. If through an open negotiating process, Syrians decide he stays with certain conditionalities, who am I to say that that's not right? I leave that to Syrians. I have my opinion, but in the end, I'm not a Syrian and I'm not going to be living in Syria. The people who live there have to make those decisions, and I'm not going to second guess them. I will say, I think if he stays, it's going to be a tough negotiation. There's a lot of anger among young people in the Arab world at the United States for having worked with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, for example, or Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or the Khalifa emirs and king in Bahrain. But I don't think America ultimately is responsible for the Arab Spring, because these are all countries which have sovereignty, and ultimately they may make their own decisions. They don't always do what the United States tells them. If they did, we wouldn't need to write complaints in our annual human rights reports about the way they treat their own citizens. So ultimately, the Arab Spring is about not just young people, but people in general in that part of the world wanting to live in dignity. And what that means when I say dignity, it means, I didn't say democracy, I said dignity, and that means not having to pay corrupt officials for even simple things like driver's licenses or business licenses. It means not being abused if you're arrested by the police. It means not being arrested on the whim of an angry police officer. It means that the law is respected, that there is a rule of law. I think they talk about freedom, and they mean freedom from that kind of government oppression. Democracy is a much harder thing to build. Right now, I think they're just trying to get freedom from oppressive dictatorships. I think we in the United States government and in the Foreign Service in general have perhaps not understood as well as we should have how important the divide between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims is. I think because for the most part we have worked in foreign embassies in Sunni Muslim countries where there either were no Shia, Egypt is an example, or Morocco or Tunisia, Jordan, for example. We just weren't really paying attention to it. When we got to Iraq, I think many of us, myself included, were initially not fully aware of how deep and important the divide is. And I think right now, in 2014, the split, the conflict between Sunni and Shia is the most important conflict in the Middle East. Our actions in Iraq, in a sense, may have taken a heavy foot, Saddam Hussein's foot, or his boot, if you will, off of the box. I mean, it was holding the lid down, and there was a lot of repression, there was a lot of killing on sectarian bases inside Iraq under Saddam Hussein, but it was kind of in the box and perhaps on a somewhat smaller scale sometimes, not always. But once that boot came off and that lid came off, we saw the country leap into a sectarian civil war in 2006 and 7 with our soldiers sort of right in the middle of it, and it took us years to get a government that would begin to address it. There are a lot of really smart people who've worked in the region even longer than me, like journalist Robin Wright, who says that the borders are being challenged along, say, between Syria and Iraq, for example, or Syria and Lebanon. Absolutely, they're under challenge in a way that we haven't seen perhaps really since the 1950s, when some of the Arab countries embarked on unity schemes, Egypt and Syria, or Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. I don't know where they're going to end up. I think at a minimum, countries like Iraq and Syria, which have suffered from sectarian conflict and ethnic conflict for years, will have to find a new way to decentralize. Otherwise, the conflicts drag on and on. I'm hopeful that Iraq is on the way to that now. There are, as we speak in September 2014, there are negotiations underway for a new Iraqi government, and decentralization is on the agenda for that new government, if it is in fact voted and approved. But these are tough things to negotiate. Well, I think there'll be several. At the top, of course, will be security and what to do about the Islamic State. Part of that then will involve necessarily our working with an Iraqi government, a new government. Will that be a credible government? Will it be a government that keeps to its commitments, not only to us, but to other Iraqis? And on the Syrian side, as we deal with the security issues related to the Islamic State, can the ways that we apply measures to contain and reduce the Islamic State, can we do it in such a way as to make possible a new political negotiation, since ultimately the Islamic State sprang in Syria out of dissatisfaction among Syrian Sunnis about their treatment at the hands of the Assad regime. So there's going to have to be some art in the way we deal with the Islamic State in Syria. And I think more broadly in the region, we do not want to get sucked into the Sunni-Shia conflict. But neither do we want to see it spiral out of control. And so whether it be working to contain the Iranian nuclear problem, or the conflict on the ground between Sunni states and the Shia group led by Iran, that's going to be a big challenge to us in the region in the next year. The security forces that were brutalizing the peaceful protesters and by May and June started killing 20, 30 a week were largely from the minority Alawi sect in Syria, to the extent that the regime was using the most loyal security units, which were largely Alawi, to confront, to arrest, and when necessary, shoot to kill. I say when necessary, it was never necessary, but when ordered, would shoot to kill the protesters. And so very quickly, the protest movement identified the Alawi community as being responsible for much of the bloodshed. That wasn't really fair. There were a lot of Alawis who, at great personal risk, were actually joining the protest movement. Sometimes when they were arrested, their treatment at the hands of fellow Alawis in the security forces was even worse, even more brutal than that of Sunnis, because those Alawis viewed the dissident Alawis as traitors. So, but the regime in general has tried to use the sectarian card as a means of consolidating its support among that minority Alawi community to limit the extent of dissension among the Alawi ranks, and in so doing has terribly aggravated fault lines within Syrian society that date back centuries.